In this tip, we're going to talk about a feature that is very, very popular in other pieces of audio software, but appears to be missing from Ableton Live. And what this is the ability for the piece of audio software to find a transient event and then snap the playhead to it, usually for the purposes of editing. Ableton is very, very powerful and very, very fast when we're moving on the grid. And you can kind of see how I can move around as quickly as I can move with my arrow keys, which is great. But if I happen to have anything that doesn't fall perfectly on the grid, this is when this could become a bit of a problem for me. Let's move down into the sample editor here, and I'll show you an example of a time when something's not perfectly on the grid, and yet Ableton can very, very easily find the transient information and allow you to edit it. So first things first, we know that when we're looking at any of these samples, there's always going to be transient markers that are going to show us that there's an event, an audio event that's happening, whether or not there are warp markers there. Now I'm going to zoom way in, and the reason I'm going to zoom way in is because it's very, very common for all pieces of audio software to make their own choices where audio events begin, and oftentimes they happen right where there's a tiny, tiny bit of amplitude, but not necessarily very close to where anything is happening that you can hear. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to click kind of in the area of where my my transient really begins to hit. This is so that I can maintain any timing that I want to be able to use if I want to cut this and then reinforce with another drum hit exactly underneath it on another track, or whatever I want to do with it. Now initially, if I click this, it doesn't appear like anything's really happening other than I just made a selection. But now if I click on the track title bar, you'll notice that a line is created up here in the edit, and if I zoom in, it's exactly lined up where it was down in the sample editor. This now means I have the ability to cut that and separate it out. I have the ability to separate this entire piece out. I can reverse it, or I can even deactivate it. But all of these things that I've done are happening independent of my grid. And if we keep zooming in, you can see I'm not quite landing on any of the grid lines, and that's okay. Like, part of the idea here is, despite how profoundly useful the grid is in Ableton, it should in no way confine your ability to make music. And one of the things that we try to always encourage is make the music in the software. Don't let the software change that music or dictate what the music needs to do. And so in this case, you can see it took a second to find where my audio was, and I was being dainty with it. If I was moving faster, I could just kind of click around and get it pretty close. I'm happy with it. I click in my title bar and then boom, make my edits. Now, there's definitely a conversation that could be had about whether or not, well, why wouldn't I just go in and edit the warp markers and move things? But that's operating under the assumption that everything needs to be perfectly on the grid. And we know musically that's often not true. So in this case, we get the best of both worlds. We get a performance where things are very, very tight on the grid, and some other things that aren't but sound really good because the pocket they're played in is very consistent. It sounds musical. This is now introducing the opportunity for us to use both things. Now, obviously, this is a little bit slower than if I was moving around just using my arrow keys with the grid, but it's also a little bit more of a specific use case, right? Oftentimes when we're doing house or techno or other styles of electronic music where they're very, very tightly connected to the grid, you'll find that you don't have this problem because oftentimes, even if we do things like swing and groove, okay, those are sort of additions to things we've already done once we've moved the audio or the MIDI events. But here, this is a good example of a time when maybe you just need one thing that you need to cut and either reinforce with another thing below it, or you need to move for some reason in some way. This is a way that you can do that. This also makes it easy because if I want to be able to go in and quickly slice out the beginning of pieces and throw them into simplers or samplers or use them in other ways, I can do that as well. Although we know in Ableton there's lots of ways to do everything, so in that case I could even just kind of randomly grab a piece and then edit it inside the simpler because it's so fast. Hopefully this tip helped you see that this is a really, really simple process that gives you a lot of the power you get in some of those other programs right here inside of Ableton.